Many light novels and mangas aren't strangers to bad adaptations. If the studio isn't fully committed to bringing the vision of the author to life on the screen, anime adaptation often turns into a glorified advert for the original source material. As someone who has been watching anime for several years now, having your favorite series get a bad adaptation is something that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Yet, when looking at series that do not originate from Japan, this is something that I had almost come to expect. Webtoon and manhwa adaptations are a relatively recent innovation in the anime market, and one that has been quite a mixed bag at that. Having fan-favorite series be adapted is almost never a bad thing, but the way in which industry giants such as Noblesse, Tower of God, and God of High School were adapted left much to be desired. So when one of my favorite light novels and webtoons got the green light for an anime, I was cautiously optimistic. I knew the chances of it being great were slim, but I thought it would at worst be an alright experience. But that optimism turned into full-blown delusion with the release of one particular anime. Solo Leveling was, and still is, one of the most popular manhwa, and despite it not being my absolute favorite, its anime could usher in a new age of non-Japanese media getting good anime adaptations. And while season 1 was already pretty good, the production quality in season 2 made my jaw drop. And if I said I didn't expect at least a comparable quality of animation for the beginning after the end, I would be lying. But those expectations were misplaced to say the least. The anime studio being Studio ACAT should have been a dead giveaway, and they couldn't even be bothered to animate it themselves, instead outsourcing it to Chinese production companies. Far from being an advert for the novel or webtoon, the show might be a deterrent instead, getting turned into the laughingstock of the entire anime community. So today, I want to show you what the series actually has in store and may motivate you to give the original work a shot as well. In general, I would say the story can be separated into 4 distinct parts: the beginning arc, the war arc, the Alacryan arc, and the return to the coffin. While these could be divided into further, more specific arcs, each of these have a very distinct vibe and narrative through line that stretches throughout it. Unfortunately, I have to say that part 1 is by far the weakest of the bunch. It is a tried and true cliché in the anime community to say that, oh, give it time, the show gets much better later on. Just read till chapter X or watch till episode X and then it's peak. And honestly, most of the time I despise this rhetoric. If a show was that good, it would at least be somewhat good from the start, right? But the beginning after the end might be my one exception to that. The anime might not have done the first few arcs any favors, but even as one of the series' biggest fans, I do have to admit that these few arcs are quite generic. A guy gets transported into another world as a baby and awakens his magical abilities very early on due to the knowledge he took with him from his previous life. He then gets transported away from his home and has to adapt to live away from there while trying to get back home. He then becomes an adventurer and eventually attends a magic academy. Sound familiar? Well, that's because all these same story beats also appear in Mushoku Tensei. In fact, it almost appears as if the story and its consequences were watered down a bit. Instead of having to spend years on a continent far away from home, not knowing about how his family was doing or if they were even alive, like Rudius did, Arthur had it comparably much easier. Yes, he was badly injured in a fight with bandits and separated from his family, but after a few weeks trekking in the forest with a girl he rescued, they reached the Elven Kingdom. It turns out the girl was in fact the Elven Princess, and he even got to contact his family to tell them he was okay. At first, I did quite enjoy the story, but I didn't think it was anything that special. Nothing in it was anything that I hadn't seen before. Arthur's backstory was intriguing for sure, but the small glimpses we got of it in the beginning were so far and few between that they were a nice bonus more than anything. However, I had a nagging feeling that there was something special coming. In fact, it almost felt like the author was rushing through these first few arcs in order to get to that special part. Parts of the story that took Mushoku Tensei 14 arcs to get through were crammed into only 4 arcs here. And I was completely right. While I wouldn't call the first part of the story bad by any means, in fact it was more enjoyable than a lot of other stories with the same setup, it's part 2, 3 and 4 of the story that really make it shine and stand apart from the rest. Not only does the beginning after the end feature a rich world with fantastic story building, but Arthur, the main protagonist's character arc, is also phenomenal. Although most tune into series like these for the fights or the mystique of another world, this series has another special thing going for it. The action and the hype are interspersed with some introspective and emotional moments with writing that generally has me tearing up at points. Now, before I continue with the video, I will have to warn you that it does contain spoilers for the novel. So if you've only watched the anime or read the comic, I'd recommend reading the novel before continuing to watch the video. A story like this lives and dies with its protagonist. These types of reincarnation stories often feel a bit weird. When an adult gets reincarnated, the age gap between the body and soul of the main character often creates some weird circumstances. It is a given that he acts more mature than he actually is, but once he becomes a teenager and interacts with others who are the same age as his body, questions start to arise. If he acts like a teenager, there is a discrepancy between his mental age and how he acts. But if he acts like an adult, there is a discrepancy between his physical age and how he acts. And that's where his rather unique past comes in. While his backstory takes a while to be revealed, in fact it sort of gets drip fed to us throughout the entire story, its effect can be felt from the very beginning. Unlike many other isekais whose protagonists have a quite generic backstory for them to be relatable to the general audience, the beginning after the end actually uses the main character's backstory to develop his personality. Being a king in his past life explains his very calm and collected attitude in the face of adversity, especially in the beginning of the story. But it also explains his somewhat stunted emotional maturity. When he was still king, he often had to hide and ignore his emotions, and switching that off isn't something that can be done in the blink of an eye. And him being an orphan fixes something that often bugs me in other similar stories. When a person has lived in a relatively happy family, it makes little sense for them to be so attached to their new family. But for Arthur, it makes perfect sense. While he had a somewhat happy upbringing in the orphanage with his 2 best friends and the headmaster, after her death, his life was pretty much devoid of any familial relations. So when his new parents shower him with the type of parental love he's never really experienced, he obviously clings to it pretty fast. And that attachment actually becomes a pretty big hindrance in the war arc. To say that the beginning after the end becomes a totally different story after the attack on the academy would be a large understatement. While Arthur does experience some tragedy, like the loss of Sylvia and him being separated from his parents for a while, there's nothing compared to what would happen in the war arc. The attack on the academy itself already portrays the seriousness of the situation. Several members of the student council get injured or killed, Arthur's childhood friend gets heavily injured, and his best friend gets kidnapped by the attackers. It's the aftermath of the situation, however, that really shows that the tone of the story has shifted. Arthur arrives late, but still manages to defeat the enemy and save the rest of the students. But instead of being lauded as a hero, he gets detained. The perpetrator of the attack was the little brother of one of the Lances, the strongest mages that exist, and his excessive violence against him earns him the ire of that Lance. While he does manage to evade his punishment and leave for Epheostus to train, this does show the seriousness of the situation. The war arc itself really did impress me for how it handled the concept of war. While the existence of very powerful mages does change the dynamics of war, its fundamentals stay the same. One thing I appreciate is how the Lances, and Arthur especially, aren't portrayed or used as some all-powerful being. While he is plenty powerful and is capable of destroying hundreds of enemies on their own, he is just one singular person. If attacks are conducted on several locations at once, he can only be in one of those places. This is especially relevant when he has to decide whether to defend the human or the elven kingdom. But the most important part to me is the human aspect of the war. While other series often only focus on the main character, the same cannot be said for the beginning after the end. The main continent is divided into 3 different kingdoms: elven, human, and dwarven, with each of these having different values and objectives. While the war did somewhat unite them, it did not erase decades of mistrust and conflict between them. And nowhere can this be seen more clearly than the incident of Arthur's trial. The dwarven royals sold out to the Alacryans for their own gain, the humans for the lives of their family, while the elves were left in the dark and tried to support Arthur because he had saved their daughter. In general, it is also very interesting to see a person's reaction in the face of overwhelming power. When it became obvious that Agrona's army would win, their reaction really tells you a lot about who a person really is. Whether they try to take responsibility to help their continent, whether they rush into battle head first, or sell out the continent for their own selfish gain or to save their family. Another interesting tidbit is the fact that we see at least some bits and pieces from the perspective of the enemy's foot soldiers. The fact that they struggle throughout their mission, have some close shaves with death, makes them feel much more like actual people rather than just faceless entities that just exist to oppose the main character. But by far the most interesting part of the story, in my opinion, is the Alacryan arc. After Sylvie sacrifices herself for him, Arthur finds himself transported into the relic tombs, deep in the heart of the continent of the enemy. In the beginning, it's all about survival. His mana core is broken, which is something that would normally be a death warrant for any other human. But he proceeds to do something that no one, not even the Asuras, the so-called gods of this world, have been able to do before. Form a core out of ether. And where mana is the most bog standard power system there is, ether is quite the opposite of that. Whereas mana has a very linear path of progression when it comes to getting stronger, ether is much more interesting. Instead of getting stronger by mindless training, increase in strength comes from the so-called insight. Unlocking new powers, so-called god runes, requires Arthur to gain insight into whatever new power he wants to master. This, in my opinion, gives a much more satisfying way for him to get stronger across his journey. But that's not the only interesting part about Alacrya. Arthur not only gets challenged in terms of power, but also in terms of morality. It would be easy to see everyone on this continent as an enemy. They murdered thousands of your own people, after all, including family and friends, and kidnapped your childhood crush and your best friend. All that is true, and yet it would still be wrong to generalize the entire population of a continent off of that. Arthur does that, of course, in the beginning. He's hurt and he's afraid of seeing Alacryans as anything other than the enemy. But over the course of his rather long stay there, he meets people that break that worldview. Kaera, whom he bonds with during his several descents into the relic tombs, Ceres, who initially saved him back during the war arc, Alaric, who saved him when he first entered the civilization again by teaching him about Alacryan society without any questions. And when he ends up as a teacher at a school in Alacrya, he's obviously hesitant to actually teach the kids there. They would, after all, end up fighting his people in the war. But he even warms up to them. He realizes that the person he should be blaming is Agrona, who started the war in the first place, instead of the people who were just following the orders of an almighty deity that could end them with the flick of a finger. Now, I would be remiss if I talked about the beginning after the end without talking about the other two reincarnates, Nico and Cecilia. Overall, I'd say these two and their POVs are some of the most highly criticized parts of the story. and for good reason. Their POVs aren't terribly interesting and often interrupt much more interesting story sections of other characters. But there is one criticism that I often hear that doesn't really carry much weight in my opinion. These two, especially Cecilia, often get called quite dumb. And yeah, they often do act that way. But that makes sense. The obvious comparison is Arthur. On the surface, he has very similar circumstances, and despite some lapses in judgment, he acts composed and smart most of the time. But that simply isn't fair to Nico and Cecilia. Whereas Arthur has had a full past life and another life where he grew up with a loving family, all helping shape him to be a good person, the other two had none of those privileges. Cecilia was continually experimented on in her past life, and Nico was drowning in grief after her death, leaving Arthur, or Grey back then, had killed her in cold blood. And after they were reincarnated, instead of experiencing a loving family for once, they get pulled into the clutches of a grown-up, being manipulated to do his bidding. Look, I'm not trying to excuse their actions here, but seeing them as just kids, desperately trying to finally be able to live a normal life for once, does put their actions into perspective just a little bit. I don't think the beginning after the end, even when just talking about the novel, is a perfect story by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't have the most original or compelling narrative out there, and some parts of the story can feel a bit dragged out. But overall, I do truly enjoy the story, and watching Arthur grow throughout it is truly awesome. That's why what happened with the anime adaptation is such a shame. The story, something that a lot of people obviously enjoy, getting ruined by what can only be described as PowerPoint presentation type animation, is very disappointing. But I don't want to keep harping on this point, as I'm sure it's been discussed ad nauseum. So I want to end this video on a bit of a more positive note. Although there are some valleys throughout the over 500 chapter long story, the peaks are phenomenal, with some of the most fantastic emotional story writing in any web novel I've ever read. I think when the story comes to an end, we can all look back on the story as a whole and appreciate it for what it was. A fantastic fantasy story that often broke out of the boundaries of what a typical isekai story should be, and I for one am thankful for TurtleMe for writing such a fun and interesting story. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider leaving a like, commenting and subscribing. Thanks for watching.